risk assessments and what they are. All righty. If you want to get a hold of us, you can get us at contact@michaelmannsecurityservices.com, or you can always call us at 615-956-3912. So let's get into what this is, a more detailed explanation. So a risk assessment, so if you're a security professional, you're asked to do this. Here's what the risk assessment is. It is a process used to identify potential hazards and analyze what could happen if an incident occurs. So basically, all we're doing in the risk assessment is trying to determine what exposure our assets have to a very specific hazard or incident, and measure that, and then communicate that back to the organization, one, and then two, figure out these countermeasures that we need to put in place to try to mitigate the risk of this. Okay, so that very simply is the risk assessment. Now, you heard this on the video. Here's how we measure risk. So one, we're always going to measure risk by threat or likelihood. So threat is the likelihood of some undesirable event occurring. Now, threat by definition could be some sort of an incident that is going to compromise these assets, and we're going to talk about that here in just a minute. So threat could also be the intent and capability that you have measured of a very specific adversary. All right, so we're doing a threat analysis in this risk measurement of what the likelihood of this incident could be to occur against our very specific asset. Then what we're going to do is we're going to take vulnerability. So we're going to look for system weaknesses, very specifically those weaknesses that could impact that asset you're trying to protect. So it would allow this adversary or this threat to occur. We're going to try to find those vulnerabilities, and they could be both observable and they could be exploitable. So observable is a hole in the fence. Exploitable can mean we have like not so much robust access policy, and insider threats have the ability to get inside our facility. So that's an example of both the observable and exploitable. So we're looking for those system weaknesses. And then what we're going to do is we're going to figure out the consequence, the impact that this threat and these vulnerabilities would actually have on the assets, and then we multiply those. We'll talk about this in a later video on the different methods, whether it's qualitative or quantitative. But a basic measurement here is we're always just going to take threat times vulnerability times consequence, and that is going to give us our risk number. If it is a qualitative risk assessment, again, we're going to cover that in a short video. Okay. Now, here's the steps for the risk assessment, guys. You're going to go in there and you're going to identify these critical assets. Now, what's the difference between a regular asset and critical asset? Well, you have a lot of assets, but really it's going to be impossible for you to protect all those assets. There's always going to be some residual risk here that you just can't mitigate. That's just all there is to it. So the critical assets are those assets where any kind of compromise is going to create an unacceptable risk to the organization. So there's some ways that you would do that. So we're going to look for those critical assets, and we're going to identify what those are. We're also going to identify in those critical asset and that critical asset identification some things that could happen that could cause a problem. Okay. The next step is we go in. Here's where the likelihood piece comes in. We're going to conduct that threat assessment. Remember, we talked about the threat assessment is any kind of an event that could compromise the asset, and it also is the intent and capability of that specific adversary. So you're going to go identify what those threats are, and then through a detailed analysis, figure out what their intent and capability are to attempt to try to compromise that asset. That is the threat assessment. Once we, and if you've taken some of our study classes like CPP or PSP, then you've heard me talk about things like DBT, design basis threat. So out of that threat assessment, you actually would develop a design basis threat. The next step is you're going to conduct that vulnerability assessment. And that vulnerability assessment, again, is we're looking for very specific system weaknesses, both observable and exploitable. And we could, especially in a qualitative assessment, we actually could assign a number to that to figure out the level of vulnerability. Okay, so we're going to look at these vulnerabilities. We're going to document them. We're going to look at just how serious they are, and that is going to help us in the assessment. And then the last piece is we are going to determine the consequence or impact level. And actually, this kind of goes back up to identifying critical assets. When we identify some of these incidents that could occur, we're actually determining consequence or impact level in that critical asset analysis. And then again, we just multiply these elements together, and that gives us our risk level. Okay, so real quick and dirty video on what a risk assessment is and the steps on a risk assessment. Okay, all right, folks. Hey, if you want to get certified as a certified protection professional, CPP, and that's the subject matter expert in security management, as a physical security professional, PSP, and that's the subject matter expert in conducting risk assessments, security planning, and then physical security systems. Or if you're, don't have the time to have the CPP or PSP, so you don't have the requirements, meet the requirements, the APP or Associate Protection Professional, it's kind of a mini CPP, and it also certifies you in kind of smaller or less domains in security management. So these are the gold standards in physical security and security management through ASIS, or American Society for Industrial Security. We do these free throughout the year, 2 or 3 times a year. So if you want to get more information on getting certified as a CPP, PSP, or APP at no cost, then again, join our mailing list there at the link below, and then you'll get those announcements as we provide these study sessions. All right, folks, again, if you want to get a hold of us, contact at michaelmannsecurityservice.com, or you can get us at 615-956-3912. And remember, folks, it's about prevention, not response.